Alright, welcome back to our channel. Today we're talking about something pretty critical for our energy future: uranium. You see, nuclear power is making this huge comeback all over the world as we scramble for clean energy. But the whole thing really boils down to one simple but massive question. And that question is, with all these plans for new reactors, we're talking about hundreds of them globally, do we actually have enough fuel for all of them? Is there enough uranium in the ground to power this whole new nuclear age? Well, let's find out. Okay, so to get our heads around whether the supply can keep up, first we've got to understand the demand. Just how big is this comeback for nuclear energy? What are we really talking about here? You know, people are calling it a nuclear renaissance, and honestly, that's not an exaggeration. The push is coming from two main places: countries wanting energy security so they're not reliant on others, and of course, the big one, climate change goals. So when you look at the projections, global nuclear capacity is set to soar. If you look at the high growth scenarios, we could be looking at more than double our current nuclear output by 2050, and that's a massive increase. So, who's behind all of this? Well, you've got China, which is just on a building spree, expanding its fleet like crazy. Then there is the US, which is playing it smart by extending the life of its existing reactors while also backing brand new designs. Over in Europe, countries you'd expect like France and the UK are investing, but so are Poland and Romania. And what's really interesting is the new players entering the game. You've got nations in the Middle East and Africa for the first time ever saying, hey, we want in on nuclear power. Alright, so the demand picture is pretty clear, right? It's going up and it's going up fast. So let's flip the coin and look at the supply side. Where on earth do we actually find this stuff? The global map of uranium might not be what you think. But first, a really quick but important definition. When we talk about uranium resources, we're not talking about every single atom of uranium on the planet. Of course not. We're talking about the stuff that's found in clumps. Concentrations that are big enough that we can actually dig it up and make a profit. It's all about the economics here. And when you look at where those resources are, one thing jumps out at you: how concentrated it all is. Get this, Australia by itself is sitting on a huge chunk of the world's known supply. In fact, you're looking at a situation where just 5 countries basically control the vast majority of all uranium we think we can get to. Talk about not being evenly spread out. And here's another super important distinction you've got to understand. The best way to think about it is like a sponge soaked in water. The total amount of water in the sponge, that's what we call the in situ resource. It's the total amount estimated to be in the ground. But the recoverable resource, that's just the water you can actually squeeze out. And how much you can squeeze out depends on how strong your hands are. That's our technology. And whether it's even worth the effort, that's the price. The gap between what's there and what we can get can be enormous. So it's one thing to know where the uranium is. It's a whole other challenge to actually get it out of the ground and ready for a reactor. That journey from mine to power plant is long, it's complicated, and boy is it expensive. Let's take a look at how that actually works. Now, this is where things get really interesting from a geopolitical standpoint. Remember how Australia has the most resources? Well, check this out. Kazakhstan produces the most, and not just by a little, by a huge margin. We're talking about 43% of the world's uranium supply in 2022 came from Kazakhstan. That makes them, without a doubt, the single most important player in the entire nuclear fuel supply chain. So, how do they actually pull it out of the earth? Well, there are basically 3 ways to do it. If the uranium is close to the surface, you just dig a massive open pit mine. If it's buried really deep, you've got to go underground with traditional tunnels. But the method that's really taken over, especially in a place like Kazakhstan, is called in situ leaching, or ISL. It's pretty clever actually. They pump a liquid down to dissolve the uranium right out of the rock underground and then just pump the uranium-rich solution back to the surface. It's usually cheaper and a bit gentler on the landscape. And this right here, this is a great imbalance of the nuclear world. You see, the top producers, right, Kazakhstan, Canada, Namibia, then you look at the top consumers, the US, China, France. See the disconnect? The countries burning through the most nuclear fuel are almost completely different from the ones that are actually producing it. And that gap creates this really interesting and sometimes pretty tense global market. And that whole market, that whole delicate dance between the producers and the consumers, it all comes down to one thing. The one factor that decides whether a mine opens or closes: the price. Just look at this. For pretty much a decade, uranium prices were just stuck in the basement. They were so low that it didn't make sense to mine, so a lot of projects were put on ice and investors just walked away. But then, around 2021, something changed. The price didn't just go up, it spiked. And that spike was like a giant wake-up call to the entire industry, basically screaming, hey, it's time to get back to work. And the industry definitely heard that call. Because of those higher prices, we're now seeing about 15,000 tons of annual production capacity coming back online. These are mines in places like Canada and Namibia that were just sitting dormant, waiting. That is a huge amount of new supply hitting the market, and it's all because the price finally made it worth their while. Before we continue, why don't you give me your stance on nuclear energy? Are you for it, or are you against it, or haven't you made up your mind yet? And on your way down to the comment section, consider clicking that subscribe button. It really helps a lot. Okay, so let's recap. We've got demand that's surging, we've got a supply that's concentrated in a few places, and we have a price that's been on a roller coaster. So let's put all those pieces together and finally answer that big question we started with. So, what's the bottom line? When it all comes down to it, do we have enough? Is there enough fuel to power this nuclear comeback? Well, the answer coming straight from the experts who write the book on this stuff is a classic yes, but. The good news is yes, geologically speaking, there is enough uranium in the Earth's crust to meet even the most optimistic demand for decades. The resource is there, but, and you knew there was a but, it's not just going to jump out of the ground on its own. Getting it requires a serious, massive and sustained level of investment. And that but comes with some pretty big hurdles. For starters, we're talking about billions of dollars and often more than a decade just to get a new mine up and running. Think about it. Investors aren't going to drop that kind of cash unless they feel pretty certain that prices are going to stay high enough for them to make their money back. Then there is a geopolitical risk. We already saw how concentrated production is. A political crisis in a key country, say like Niger, can take a huge slice of the world's supply offline overnight. The whole chain is fragile. So in the end, the real bottleneck for our nuclear future isn't actually the lack of uranium in the ground. The planet has plenty of it. The real scarcity is in time, money, and maybe most importantly, political will. The fuel is there. The real question is, can we get ourselves organized to get it out of the ground in time? That's what we'll be observing. Thanks for watching this video. See you in the next one. Peace.